Nathan led Maya into his office with the measured steps of a man who had spent years commanding respect in boardrooms, where fortunes rose and fell on the edge of his words. The office was a place designed to intimidate, walls lined with shelves of leather-bound books, a massive oak desk that seemed to divide ruler from subordinate, and tall windows draped in heavy curtains that only allowed the faintest slivers of moonlight to intrude. Maya entered quietly, balancing Malik against her shoulder, her face pale but steady, while Eli clung to her skirt and followed as though he belonged nowhere else. Nathan's gaze flickered briefly to his son before settling back on her, his jaw tight, his fingers curling into fists he quickly forced open. He gestured to a chair in front of the desk. "Sit." His tone was clipped, commanding, but lacked the explosive fury of before. Maya obeyed, settling carefully into the chair with Malik nestled in her arms, Eli pressing close to her side. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint crackle of the fireplace and the soft breaths of the children. Nathan remained standing, pacing behind his desk as though sitting would grant her some undeserved equality. His thoughts churned, and when he finally spoke, his words were heavy with the strain of a man caught between pride and a truth he did not wish to face. "I need to understand," he said at last, his voice lower than she expected. "My son, my heir, barely speaks to me. For years he has hidden behind silence as though the world is too much for him. Yet after one moment with you, he calls you Mama, as if you are the only one he trusts. I have given him everything. Doctors, teachers, toys, the best care money can buy. And still he clings to you as though his life depends on it. Why?" His voice cracked slightly, and though he quickly steadied it, the rawness lingered in the air like smoke. "What are you to him?" "What are you to me?" Maya's heart pounded in her chest, but she met his gaze without lowering her eyes. She could have chosen silence, could have deflected his accusations with polite half-answers, but something inside her refused to cower. She had risked her life for Eli, endured the slap of his hand, the venom of the staff, the judgment of the world beyond the gates, and now she would not allow herself to be diminished by suspicion. "I am nothing more than what your wife once asked me to be," she said quietly, her voice carrying a calmness born of truth. "She trusted me to sit with her, to care for Eli when she was too weak, to be a friend when she had none. I did not come into this house to take her to climb. I came because she saw me as a person, not just a maid. And I stayed because I needed the work, because I needed to keep my own child alive. Everything else has happened because your son, your beautiful, frightened son, saw me. And for reasons I cannot fully explain, he chose me to be his safe place. I did not ask for that. I could not have planned it. But I will never turn him away." Nathan stopped pacing, her words striking deeper than he expected. He turned sharply toward the window, staring at his reflection in the glass as though it might reveal something about himself he had long ignored. His wife had chosen Maya. His son had chosen her too. What did it say about him? That the two people he loved most had found solace in the same woman while he, with all his power, had remained at a distance. His throat tightened with the bitter taste of failure, and though pride urged him to dismiss her explanation, to accuse her of manipulation, he found the words lodged painfully in his chest. He could not lie to himself, not when the evidence lay sleeping against her shoulder and clinging to her side. Eli shifted then, his small voice rising into the silence. "Papa," he whispered, the word fragile but clear, startling both adults into stillness. Nathan turned, his eyes widening, for his son had rarely addressed him directly. Eli's gaze darted between his father and Maya, his fingers tightening on her skirt as if asking her for courage. "Mama saved. Mama safe, Papa. Safe too?" The words tumbled awkwardly, but the meaning was unmistakable. The boy longed for safety, for unity, for the impossible healing of the broken pieces around him. Nathan's composure faltered. He crossed the room in 2 strides, dropping to one knee before his son. For a long moment, he simply looked at Eli, his blue eyes reflecting the boy's innocence and fear. And in that silence lay years of regret, of walls built too high, of love withheld because he had not known how to give it. He reached out, his hand trembling, but stopped short of touching the boy, afraid of frightening him. "Eli," he whispered, his voice breaking, "I will keep you safe. Both of you." His eyes lifted to Maya, searching hers for something he could not name. "Even if I do not know how." Maya's throat tightened, tears threatening, though she forced them back. She had seen glimpses of this man before. The grief-stricken father hidden beneath the armor of the billionaire, but never so bare, never so vulnerable. In that moment, she realized that the walls between them were not built of wealth and poverty alone, but of pain, of fear, of unspoken guilt. She did not answer him with words, for words could be twisted. Instead, she simply placed her free hand gently over Eli's, which still clutched her skirt and held his gaze steady, silently promising that she would not let go. The fire crackled in the hearth, filling the silence with warmth that seemed to soften even the coldness of the grand office. Nathan rose slowly, his expression still guarded but no longer driven by anger. For the first time since his wife's death, he allowed himself to imagine a world where trust might be rebuilt, where grief did not rule every decision, where his son's laughter might one day return. He did not speak it aloud, but the realization settled heavily in his chest. The maid he had once dismissed as invisible might hold the key not only to his son's healing, but perhaps to his own. And so part two closed not with resolution, but with a fragile shift, the faint glimmer of something neither pride nor suspicion could fully extinguish. The shadows of distrust still lingered in the mansion's corners, but beneath them flickered the faint light of understanding, small and uncertain, yet undeniable. It was the beginning of a reckoning neither Nathan nor Maya could avoid, and the boy who whispered "Mama" in the silence of the night would be the thread binding them together as their worlds collided again and again. The mansion had always been a place of rigid order, a world where every gesture was rehearsed, every hallway polished to perfection, and every servant knew their place. But after the accident, the delicate balance of hierarchy had shifted, and though it seemed subtle on the surface, the undercurrents were violent and unrelenting. Maya walked those gilded halls each day with Malik pressed against her chest, her posture upright, her head held high, but beneath her calm exterior, she could feel the weight of eyes tracking her every move. Some staff watched with admiration, others with suspicion, but all with an intensity that made her skin prickle. It was as though her very existence had become a test the household could not ignore. The breaking point arrived one afternoon in the nursery, when two nannies cornered her as she was folding Eli's small clothes, neatly stacking them into drawers. Malik was asleep on a blanket beside her, his tiny chest rising and falling peacefully, while Eli sat close to her knee, quietly tracing lines on the carpet with his toy car. The nannies' voices were sharp, their words carefully chosen to wound. "You're overstepping," one said coldly, her arms crossed over her starched uniform. "This is not your place. You're here to clean, not to steal affection that doesn't belong to you." The second added, her tone dripping with contempt, "It's dangerous, you know, letting the boy believe you're his mother. Children don't forget those kinds of lies, and when Mr. Brooks realizes what you're doing, you'll be out of here with nothing." Maya straightened slowly, folding the last shirt with deliberate calm before meeting their eyes. She had no desire for confrontation, but neither would she allow their venom to go unchallenged. "I never asked Eli to call me anything," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "He does it because he feels safe, and I will never push him away when he seeks comfort." "If that is a crime, then let it be on my shoulders, not his." The nannies scoffed, exchanging knowing glances, but they said no more. Still, their silence was not surrender, it was warning. The kind of silence that promised the spread of more rumors, more poison whispered into the ears of those who already doubted her. Eli had paused in his play, his small face tilted toward hers, his expression fragile and uncertain. Without a word, he crawled closer and leaned against her side, clutching the edge of her skirt as though to anchor himself. Maya rested a protective hand on his hair, her eyes softening, though her heart hammered in her chest. She had defended herself with dignity, but she knew dignity alone did not protect against envy or lies. The hostility of the staff could grow into something far more dangerous, especially if it reached Nathan in the wrong way. Nathan himself had been wrestling with storms of his own. He had grown restless, irritable, pacing his office late into the night, poring over documents not because he was interested, but because the silence of the estate pressed against him with too much force. The report on Maya's past still lay on his desk, the grainy images of his wife smiling beside her etched into his memory. He could not reconcile the woman in those images with the one who stood before him now, humble, bruised, yet unyielding. Every instinct he had honed as a businessman screamed to treat her with suspicion, to assume motives, to protect himself from betrayal. And yet each time he saw Eli's hand curled in hers, Each time he heard his son whisper words he had never spoken for anyone else, Nathan felt something collapse within him, a truth he could no longer ignore. She had given his child something he could not. His pride, however, was a wall he had built too high to tear down easily. That pride pushed him into avoidance, into coldness, into a silence that only deepened the distance between them. But avoidance was a poor substitute for control, and control was slipping further each day. His advisors pressed him about the rumors, about the perception of weakness, about the dangerous whispers in business circles that the mighty Nathan Brooks could not even keep order in his home. He dismissed their words outwardly, but inwardly the humiliation burned. He knew it was only a matter of time before he would have to confront Maya directly, to strip away the fog of questions and demand answers from her own lips. The moment arrived unexpectedly. Late one evening, Maya was returning from the garden path with Malik drowsing on her shoulder, and Eli clutching her hand when Nathan appeared at the far end of the hall. His presence filled the space instantly, the authority he carried like a second skin making the servants nearby freeze in their steps. His eyes locked on Maya, sharp and unrelenting, and the hallway seemed to shrink between them. For a heartbeat, neither spoke, the silence taut with the weight of everything unspoken. Then Nathan's voice cut through the stillness, lower and more controlled than it had been that day on the street, but no less powerful. "We need to talk," he said, his tone leaving no room for refusal. Maya's chest tightened, but she met his gaze without flinching. She shifted Malik carefully in her arms, felt Eli's small fingers clutch tighter at her hand, and nodded once. "Yes, Mr. Brooks," she replied softly, her voice carrying the steadiness of someone who had endured storms before and was prepared to endure another. And so, the collision that had begun on the asphalt beneath the shadow of a truck was about to reignite in the grand halls of wealth and grief. Pride and humility, suspicion and truth, pain and compassion, all converged in that moment, promising a confrontation that would determine not only Maya's place in the Brooks estate, but the very future of the fragile child whose heart already called her Mama. The whispers among the household staff soon began to take a sharper edge, transforming from murmured speculation into something colder and more divisive. What had once been idle chatter in corridors became measured glances, and what had been faint doubts grew into outright hostility in some corners of the estate. The nannies particularly felt displaced, their carefully constructed roles undermined by the boys' sudden dependence on a woman who was never meant to be more than background labor. One afternoon, as Maya polished the silver in the dining hall, she overheard two of them speaking in low voices near the pantry door.
"It isn't natural," one said, her words clipped with envy.
"Children don't suddenly attach themselves to strangers like that unless there's manipulation involved." The other agreed, bitterness dripping from her tone. "Mark my words, she's playing some long game. She wants the boy to love her so she can secure her place in this family, maybe even replace what was lost." Their words pierced Maya like shards of glass, though she kept her face still, her hands steady as she rubbed the silver to a shine. She had learned long ago that responding to cruelty only fed it, but inside she grieved at their blindness, for she had never once desired wealth or status, only the simple dignity of honest work and the chance to raise her son in safety. Even errands into the town grew heavy with suspicion. The Brooks estate was known to the public as a fortress of luxury, and news of the accident had escaped its walls like smoke escaping through cracks. When Maya carried Malik to the small grocery store, she felt the sting of eyes on her back, the quiet halt of conversations when she passed. A shopkeeper she had known for years hesitated before handing her change, his gaze flicking from her to the newspaper headline folded beside the register. She saw the words bold and cruel. "Billionaire's child saved by Maid, hero or opportunist." Maya tucked the change into her purse without looking up, her cheeks burning. Malik stirred against her chest and she kissed his soft head, whispering, "It doesn't matter what they say, my love. What matters is that we walk out of here together." Yet even as she said it, a heaviness settled in her chest, for she could not shield her son from the world's judgments forever. Eli, oblivious to the venom that swirled around them, only deepened his bond with Maya. He followed her with quiet devotion, his small footsteps echoing behind hers through the vast marble corridors. He learned to reach for her hand without hesitation, to whisper needs he had once kept locked away. One evening, as she tucked Malik into his crib, Eli climbed onto the edge of her narrow bed and lay down with a sigh. as though her tiny room were safer than his ornate nursery filled with toys he never touched. "Mama," he whispered, curling toward her warmth. Maya's heart twisted. She brushed his hair back gently and whispered, "You have a father who loves you, Eli. Don't forget that." But the boy shook his head stubbornly, his blue eyes glistening in the lamplight. "Mama saved," he repeated, as if that truth were unshakable. Maya sat in silence, her chest tight, for she knew that love could not be commanded, only given, and Eli had given his to her in a way she had never sought but could not now refuse. Nathan's fury and confusion grew heavier with each passing day. He was a man accustomed to control, to dictating the course of events with contracts and commands. Yet here was a situation where control slipped like sand through his fingers. His son, his heir, rejected his attempts at comfort and instead clung to the maid as though she were the only anchor in a sea of uncertainty. It infuriated him, not because he wished his son harm, but because it reminded him of the emptiness he could not fill since his wife's passing. He would stand in doorways late at night, watching as Maya hummed softly to both boys, her voice carrying the same gentleness his wife once possessed. And though envy gnawed at him, another feeling began to stir beneath the surface, an uncomfortable awareness that perhaps he had misjudged her entirely. But pride is a stubborn beast, and Nathan's pride was the most ferocious of all. He could not bring himself to admit aloud that he had wronged her, so instead he maintained a facade of cold indifference, speaking to her only when necessary, his words clipped and formal, though his eyes often lingered longer than he intended. Maya, in her quiet strength, noticed everything. She noticed how Nathan's gaze softened when it fell upon Eli asleep in her arms, how his hands trembled slightly when he thought no one was watching, how grief still haunted him like a ghost in every corner of the mansion. She felt no hatred for him, despite the slap that still burned in her memory, because she recognized that his anger was born not of malice but of fear. Fear of losing the only family he had left. Fear of failing in the one role money could not perfect, that of a father. Still, she kept her distance, not daring to presume forgiveness or trust. Her only focus remained Malik and Eli, two fragile souls who needed her strength more than she needed pride. Yet the storm outside the estate walls continued to brew. Rumors reached Nathan through his network of advisors that investors whispered about his careless household, that rivals laughed behind closed doors at the thought of a billionaire who could not even protect his son. Nathan felt the sting of humiliation as though it were a physical wound, and though he longed to retaliate with the sharpness of his usual authority, he knew this scandal could not be crushed with money alone. The truth, or at least his version of it, needed to be shaped carefully, and for that he needed answers from Maya herself. But confronting her meant admitting weakness, and Nathan Brooks had spent his entire life building walls to keep weakness hidden. And so, the estate remained a battlefield of unspoken words, where servants carried trays with too much stiffness, where a child whispered love to the woman who was not his mother, and where a man haunted by grief sat each night staring at a photograph of his late wife, wondering why she had trusted Maya so deeply. The shadows of distrust grew longer each day, stretching into every corner, and though no one dared speak it aloud, all felt the certainty that a reckoning was coming. Shadows of distrust. The days that followed the near tragedy were thick with tension, as though every room of the Brooks estate carried invisible smoke that made it difficult to breathe. Though the household continued its routines, the cook preparing elaborate meals, the gardeners trimming the hedges, the maids dusting chandeliers, the atmosphere was undeniably fractured. Conversations were no longer light exchanges about tasks or errands. They were whispers, laden with judgment, suspicion, and fear. Every glance at Maya carried an unspoken question. Had she been reckless, opportunistic, or truly selfless? Even Rosa, who defended her openly, could not erase the way silence would fall whenever Maya entered a room, as if her very presence forced people to weigh their loyalties. Maya endured it as she always had endured hardship, with quiet dignity and the strength of a woman who had little choice but to keep moving forward. She rose before dawn, tied Malik securely to her chest, and moved through the house, completing her work without complaint, though her arms often trembled from fatigue, and her knees still ached from the scrapes she had suffered on the asphalt. She avoided Nathan's gaze whenever possible, not from shame, but because looking into those piercing blue eyes reminded her too much of the moment his hand had struck her, and of the humiliation she had swallowed for the sake of keeping her position. Without this job, Malik would go hungry, and that thought alone was enough to silence the retorts that sometimes burned on her tongue. Nathan, for his part, was caught in a labyrinth of emotions that he could not admit even to himself. His pride refused to allow him to apologize for the way he had treated her, for the accusation he had hurled, and the hand he had raised. Yet at night, when his mind wandered restlessly, he found himself replaying the security footage, staring at the image of his late wife laughing with Maya, handing baby Eli into her care without hesitation. The sight gnawed at him because it reminded him of something he had tried to bury, that his wife had possessed an instinct for people, a gift for discerning goodness, and she had chosen Maya as a trusted companion long before Nathan had ever thought of her as a maid. That truth unsettled him, because it meant he might have misjudged her not once but twice, first by dismissing her as invisible, and second by accusing her of a scheme when she had risked everything to save his child. The outside world, however, showed no mercy. Word of the incident had escaped the gates despite Nathan's attempts to suppress it, and society's gossip columns now buzzed with speculation. Was the billionaire's household safe? Had negligence almost cost him his only heir? Paparazzi lingered at the estate's edge, hoping for a photograph that could sell for thousands. Nathan despised the intrusion. But what unsettled him more was the way some articles began to mention the mysterious maid with the infant. Her story became a canvas upon which strangers painted their own narratives. Some cast her as a heroine, others as a dangerous opportunist, and the cruelest voices suggested she had orchestrated the accident to secure a place in the Brooks legacy. Maya read none of it, but she felt the weight of judgment every time she ventured into town for groceries, every time someone's eyes lingered on her longer than necessary, every time whispers followed her like shadows. However, refused to let her stand alone in that storm. The boy clung to her more than ever, his selective words reserved only for her. He refused to sit at dinner unless Maya was nearby, refused to play with toys unless she was within sight. When Nathan attempted to draw him into conversation, Eli responded with silence or turned his head away. But when Maya entered the room, he would whisper soft requests, fragments of words that astonished the staff who had grown used to his quiet. It was not lost on anyone that the boy who had once seemed locked away behind invisible walls was now reaching outward, but only toward the maid who carried her own baby in a fraying sling. This attachment unsettled Nathan more than he wanted to admit. He told himself that Eli's behavior was temporary, a reaction born of shock. But deep inside he feared it was something more enduring, a truth about connection that money and status could not replicate. He found himself watching from a distance as Maya soothed his son to sleep, her voice a soft hum blending with Malik's babbling. He hated the pang of envy that twisted inside him, the sense that his son's healing came not from him, but from a woman he had deemed unworthy, and yet each time he considered separating them, the memory of Eli's terrified whisper, "Mama saved," echoed through him, chaining his pride to a silence he did not know how to break. Maya, meanwhile, lived in a state of quiet turmoil. She cherished Eli's trust, his small hand that sought hers, his eyes that no longer carried only fear but a spark of warmth when she entered the room. She saw in him not the son of a billionaire, but a fragile child desperate for love, the kind of love she had promised to give her own son Malik. Yet she also feared what this bond might mean for her future. She knew too well that lines of class were drawn in ink, darker than any stain she could scrub away. A maid could not hope to be family, and the more Eli clung to her, the more she risked provoking Nathan's wrath again. But what could she do? To push Eli away would be to wound him, to betray the trust he had placed in her. To embrace him openly would be to invite suspicion. She walked that tightrope daily, whispering prayers under her breath, hoping for a path forward she could not yet see. One evening, long after the house had settled into uneasy silence, Nathan sat alone in his study, the faint glow of the fireplace casting shadows across his face. In front of him lay the reports his security chief had compiled, the evidence that confirmed Maya's presence in his home long before tragedy had scarred their lives. He turned the pages slowly, his hand lingering over a photograph of his wife, her smile radiant, her arm linked with Maya's as though they were not mistress and servant, but equals, perhaps even friends. The sight carved into him a truth he could no longer deny. Maya was not an intruder in his world. She had been chosen by the one person he had loved most, trusted by the woman whose absence still haunted every corner of the mansion. For the first time, Nathan felt his anger falter, replaced by a hollow uncertainty that unsettled him more than rage ever could. He realized he would need to confront her, not with accusations this time, but with questions he was not sure he wanted answered. The following days unfolded beneath a heavy silence, one that seemed to seep into every marble column and velvet curtain of the Brooks estate. The incident on the street had become more than a passing accident. It had settled like a bruise on the household, throbbing beneath the surface no matter how much Nathan tried to ignore it. The newspapers had caught whispers of the scene, though not the full truth, and now headlines speculated on the reckless nanny or the distraught billionaire's near tragedy. Nathan had used his influence to suppress photographs, but rumors spread faster than facts, and every servant in the house carried their own version of the story on their tongues. Some said Maya had been careless. Others claimed she had been the only brave soul to move when death was a breath away. For Maya, the glances became daggers, and though she held her head high, inside she was unraveling thread by thread. At night, when the rest of the staff retired, Maya sat in her small room with Malik bundled in her arms, the ache in her bones growing heavier than any day of labor. She replayed the moment again and again in her mind. The sight of Eli in the street, the roar of the truck, the instinct that had thrown her forward with no thought for her own safety. She should have felt proud. She should have felt some measure of strength for having done the unthinkable. But instead, all she felt was shame from Nathan's hand across her face and the whispers that reduced her sacrifice to ambition. Yet even in her most fragile moments, Malik's sleepy smile or Eli's quiet presence at her side reminded her that love had been her only reason to act. She could endure the bruises of judgment if it meant both children still breathed. Eli's behavior after the accident unsettled the household more than anything else. The boy who had rarely spoken, who often hid behind silence as though words were too heavy to lift, now clung to Maya's skirts and whispered to her in the shadows of corridors. He did not call for his father, nor for the well-paid nannies who had failed to notice his disappearance that day. Instead, he sought the comfort of the maid whose hands were rough from scrubbing floors but gentle when they brushed his hair. He called her Mama again and again, until the word took root in him as naturally as breath. The other servants exchanged glances, murmuring that it was inappropriate, dangerous even, for the boy to form such attachment to someone so far below his station. Rosa, the cook, defended Maya fiercely, arguing that a child's heart could not be ordered like the evening menu, but even her voice was not enough to silence the discontent. Nathan noticed it, of course. How could he not? Every evening when he tried to coax words from his son, the boy remained locked in his silence, his blue eyes lowering like shutters against his father's presence. But the moment Maya stepped into the room, carrying Malik on her hip, Eli would stir, his lips parting, his voice barely above a whisper as he breathed that fragile word, Mama. It unsettled Nathan, not only because it revealed a gap between him and his son, but because it reminded him of the ghost he could not banish, his late wife, the only one who had ever managed to reach Eli before her passing. One evening, unable to bear the gnawing confusion, Nathan sat at his son's bedside, the shadows of the room pressing against him like questions he did not want to answer. Eli lay curled beneath soft blankets, his toy car gripped tightly in his small hand. Nathan's voice was softer than usual, stripped of its boardroom authority. Eli, he said, careful not to startle him, why do you call her Mama? The boy's eyes lifted unblinking, and then turned toward the hallway where Maya's shadow moved across the wall as she carried Malik to her room. He raised his small hand, pointing with innocence that pierced Nathan's chest. His lips parted and his small voice broke the stillness. Mama saved. The words lingered long after Eli had drifted to sleep. Nathan remained in the chair by the bed, staring at the boy's peaceful face, wrestling with emotions he could not name. Pride warred with shame, grief battled with denial. His son, the child he had given everything to protect, felt safer in the arms of a maid than in his own. The realization coiled like a serpent around Nathan's heart. He could not dismiss it, but neither could he accept it. He needed answers, not from his son, but from the past, from the very threads of Maya's life that had somehow become entangled with his own. The following morning, Nathan summoned his security chief. His instructions were curt. delivered in a tone that allowed no hesitation. "Check everything," he ordered. "I want her background, her records, any detail you can find. Search the house cameras, old files, anything from when my wife was alive. I want to know who Maya Williams really is and why my son clings to her as if she's the only one he trusts." His voice dropped, colder than ice. "Bring me the truth." Days passed with a tension that knotted tighter each hour. Maya sensed she was being watched, though no one said it aloud. She carried Malik as always, did her chores with the same diligence, endured the same whispers. But beneath it all, her chest tightened with dread. She had nothing to hide, nothing she was ashamed of. But she also knew that truth could be twisted in the hands of powerful men. Nathan Brooks was not merely her employer. He was a force that could shape or shatter her future with a single decision. She prayed quietly each night, her voice trembling as she rocked Malik to sleep. "God, give me strength to face whatever comes. Protect my son, even if I cannot protect myself." When the report finally arrived, Nathan shut himself in his office, the heavy oak door closing behind him like the lock of a vault. He scrolled through footage, scanned documents, his face unreadable as the truth unfolded. Grainy security clips flickered on the screen, captured years before when his late wife was still alive. There she was, his beloved, her laughter frozen in pixels, her hands graceful as she moved through the halls. And there beside her was Maya, not a maid in uniform but a quiet companion, a young woman who had been invited into the house not to scrub floors but to sit with his wife, to help care for Eli when Nathan's business consumed his time. He watched as his wife placed her trust in Maya, handing her their fragile child, smiling with gratitude as Maya cradled him. The image struck Nathan like a blow. His wife had known this woman, had chosen her presence, had trusted her before death had stolen her away. For a long while Nathan sat in silence, his hands gripping the edges of the desk, his heart a storm he could not control. He had thought Maya an intruder, a schemer perhaps, but the truth painted her as something far more complex. A woman who had once been trusted with the greatest treasures of his life, who had risked her own child's safety to save his, and who now, despite his cruelty, inspired his son to speak words of love. He could not decide if this realization humbled him or terrified him. All he knew was that nothing in his carefully constructed world felt steady anymore. The sound of tires screeching still echoed across the avenue when a sleek black Bentley swung violently to the curb, its polished surface catching shards of sunlight, as if the car itself were furious at what it had just witnessed. The rear door flew open and out stormed Nathan Brooks, his usually composed face twisted into something raw and terrifying. He was a man who had built empires from glass towers and ruthless contracts, who had stared down rivals in boardrooms without so much as a quiver of hesitation. But at that moment he was not the untouchable billionaire. He was only a father who had almost lost his son. The crowd parted instinctively, whispers rippling like a current of electricity. Nathan's eyes, sharp as lightning, locked on the scene before him, his small, fragile boy trembling in the arms of the maid he barely acknowledged, while her own infant clung desperately to her chest. For the briefest second his fear cracked through the armor, but it didn't soften him, it detonated into rage. "What in God's name were you thinking?" His voice boomed over the murmurs of the crowd, laced with the kind of fury that makes even strangers step back in alarm. He stormed toward them, his tailored suit a blur of movement, his polished shoes striking the pavement with authority. "I trusted you with him for one simple walk." "One, and you let him end up under a truck?" His voice rose until it seemed to shake the air itself. "Were you trying to get him killed?" Maya staggered to her feet, her knees bleeding, her arms streaked with dust and crimson scratches. Malik pressed tightly against her chest, his cries unrelenting. Eli still clung to her blouse, his tiny knuckles white, his blue eyes wide with lingering terror. She could barely catch her breath, her ribs aching, but she forced her voice out through the storm of accusation. "I saved him, Mr. Brooks," she said hoarsely, her throat dry as ash. "He slipped into the road. I ran. I pulled him out. I shielded him. Saved him?" Nathan's words snapped like a whip, his eyes blazing with suspicion and grief disguised as wrath. "You nearly crushed him. Do you have any idea?" He broke off, voice cracking, then forced it louder. "Do you have any idea what could have happened? Maybe this was your plan all along. A spectacle. A stunt to make yourself into some hero." Gasps cut through the crowd like knives. A woman at the edge of the sidewalk, clutching her purse tightly, shouted, "She just risked her life for that boy." Another voice, deep and skeptical, muttered, "Or maybe she saw an opportunity." Billionaires pay well when you save their kids. Others argued, their voices colliding in a chaotic chorus. Look at her arm, she's bleeding, that's no act. People do crazier things for money. She had her own baby in her arms, why would she risk him if this was a game? The debate swirled, sharp and merciless, surrounding Maya like a storm she could not escape. Her throat tightened, the weight of their judgments pressing down on her, but her voice was lost beneath the noise. She wanted to scream the truth, to tell them she hadn't thought of money, of recognition, of anything at all except saving a child who deserved to live. But the words tangled in her chest, suffocated by fear and exhaustion. Then before she could gather the strength to speak again, Nathan's hand lashed out. The crack of his palm against her cheek sliced through the air with brutal clarity. It was so sharp, so shocking that the entire street seemed to fall into silence. Maya staggered backward, the sting of humiliation hotter than the pain itself, clutching Malik tighter as if to shield him from the cruelty of the world. The crowd gasped collectively, horror rippling through their ranks. Rosa, the family cook who had run from the estate gate, shrieked, "Mr. Brooks!" her voice raw with disbelief. But it was not Rosa's outcry that pierced Nathan's fury. It was the soft, trembling whisper of his son. "Mama," Eli said, his small voice fragile yet ringing in the silence, the single word cutting deeper than any blade. He clung to Maya with desperate strength, burying his face against her shoulder as if she were the only anchor in a terrifying world. The word froze Nathan in place. His chest heaved, his fists clenched, and for the first time since stepping out of the Bentley, confusion flickered through his burning eyes. He looked at his son, so often silent, so often unreachable, and now he had spoken. And the word had not been Papa, it had been Mama. Nathan turned sharply, dragging in a ragged breath, unable to process the moment, unable to accept the reflection of his failure in that one fragile syllable. That night, tension lay heavy over the Brooks estate like a storm cloud refusing to break. Servants whispered in corners, their eyes darting toward Maya whenever she passed. Some looked at her with awe, others with suspicion, and a few with cold disdain, as though saving the boy had somehow upset the natural order of wealth and servitude. Maya retreated to her small quarters, her cheek still tender, her body aching, her spirit battered but unbroken. Malik gurgled softly in his makeshift crib, reaching tiny fingers toward her as though sensing her pain. She sat by his side, stroking his soft hair, whispering promises through the tears she would not let herself shed. Eli, however, refused to leave her side. When night fell and the mansion grew quiet, he crept down the hallway and into her quarters, his small hand clutching the hem of her dress. His eyes were wide, his lips pressed tight in silence, until finally, as she tucked him into a spare blanket, he whispered the word again, so faint she almost thought she had dreamed it. "Mama!" Maya's heart broke and healed at once. She brushed his hair back gently, her voice soft as a lullaby. "Sleep, little one. You're safe now." And in that moment she understood the weight of the bond forged beneath the shadow of that truck. A bond stronger than blood, stronger than fear, one that Nathan Brooks himself would not easily comprehend. The collision of worlds. The morning sun stretched its golden fingers over the sprawling Brooks estate, painting the manicured lawns and towering white columns in a glow of wealth. Birds chattered in the hedges. A fountain splashed rhythmically at the center of the circular driveway where gleaming cars waited like silent beasts. Inside the mansion, servants hurried through marble halls, polishing, arranging, ensuring that perfection, demanded daily, remained unbroken. Among them moved Maya Williams, her arms thin but strong, her steps quick and careful. Her uniform was simple, faded from too many washes, and her dark curls were tied back with a fraying ribbon. But no matter how tired she was, she carried herself with quiet dignity. On her chest, nestled in a soft sling, her 6-month-old son Malik slept with the untroubled peace only infants knew. To the other staff, Maya was both a curiosity and an annoyance. They whispered behind her back, "She brings the baby everywhere. It's unprofessional. She doesn't belong in a house like this." But Maya could not afford a nanny. Every penny she earned sweeping floors and scrubbing windows went to keeping Malik fed and clothed. She had begged Mr. Brooks once, just once, for permission to carry her child during work, and surprisingly he had agreed, though his eyes had been sharp and distant when he granted it. Maya whispered to Malik now, brushing her lips across his soft hair as she polished the brass handles of the double doors. Someday, my little star mama will build us a life where you don't have to hear whispers, where you'll be proud of me. The slam of tires on gravel shattered her thoughts. A black Bentley swept up the drive, gleaming like liquid obsidian. The driver jumped out, hurried to open the rear door, and Nathan Brooks emerged. He was a man who drew attention the way fire drew moths. Tall, broad-shouldered, his tailored suit cut to perfection. Every line of him spoke of control. His hair was a rich chestnut, though strands of gray hinted at burdens carried, and his jaw was clean and sharp. His eyes, icy blue, missed nothing. The billionaire strode up the steps, his phone pressed to his ear. "No delays," he snapped into the receiver. "I don't care what it costs. Get the deal signed today." Maya lowered her gaze, heart racing. She had been in this house for 2 years, and Nathan Brooks had hardly spoken more than a handful of words to her. To him, she was invisible, a shadow, a maid who blended into the marble floors and velvet curtains. Trailing behind him was a smaller figure, Eli Brooks, 4 years old, clutching a toy car in one hand. The boy's eyes were the same piercing blue as his father's, but there was none of Nathan's confidence in them. Eli's gaze darted nervously, as though the world were too loud, too bright. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was in whispers. Many of the staff found him peculiar, even troublesome. But Maya had noticed things others missed. The way Eli's eyes softened when he was near animals. The way his tiny fingers traced patterns in the air when he thought no one was watching. There was gentleness in him. Maya offered a small smile. "Good morning, Eli." To her surprise, the boy paused. His lips trembled as though he wanted to speak. But then he only nodded and scurried after his father. Still, the brief pause warmed Maya's heart. She had always felt a pull toward Eli, though she kept it hidden. He was lonely, she sensed, in ways money could not mend. The day unfolded as usual, endless chores, endless rushing. Malik cried, then cooed, then slept again against her chest. By late afternoon, Maya's feet ached and her arms bore fresh red marks from scrubbing. She was on her way out the gates when she noticed something. Eli stood by himself at the edge of the driveway. The nanny who should have been with him was nowhere to be seen. He had dropped his toy car, and as it rolled down the slope, Eli chased after it, straight toward the busy street where trucks and taxis roared by. Maya's blood froze. "Eli!" she screamed. He didn't stop. His little legs carried him straight into danger, right into the path of an oncoming semi-truck barreling down the lane. The horn blared, a monstrous metallic bellow. Tires screamed as the driver slammed his brakes. But the truck was too close. Maya didn't think. She just moved. "Hold on tight," she screamed at herself, at Malik, at fate itself. She lunged forward, her body propelled by pure instinct. Malik wailed against her chest as she scooped Eli into one arm. The truck's grill filled her vision like a steel wall. Impact never came. Instead, Maya hurled herself and the children to the ground, rolling across rough asphalt. The world became a blur of sparks, roaring metal and burning rubber as the truck thundered over them. She curled around the boys, scraping her knees and arms raw against the concrete, praying the wheels would not dip toward them. Seconds stretched like hours. Malik's cries pierced the chaos. Eli clung to her blouse, his face buried in her shoulder. The smell of rubber and oil stung her lungs. Then silence. The truck screeched to a halt yards away. The world snapped back, filled with honking horns and gasps from horrified onlookers. Maya dragged herself forward, shoving Eli and Malik out from beneath the trailer until sunlight washed over them again. She collapsed to her knees, chest heaving, blood trickling down her forearm. Eli trembled but alive. Malik wailed but safe. And then, for the first time in weeks, Eli's small voice whispered, hoarse but steady, "Mama,